Enslaved Burial Ground, which forms the latest installment of our Newton Uncovered lecture series, is particularly appropriate for today of all days. My name is Kay Hall. I am the Education and Community Outreach Officer here at the museum. And welcome to Newton Uncovered, exploring the 21st century legacy of the enslaved burial ground at Newton. Before we get started into the main part of our program this evening, I'm going to introduce to the podium Mrs. Michelle Hinkson-Cox. She is a PhD candidate at Glasgow. She's also worked with the museum for a quite long period of time with regard to unearthing the various legacies of our enslaved past, but particularly with regard to spaces like Newton. We've done great work with her and her theatre art students. We are seeing really great results with using applied theatre as a tool for connecting not just the young people that we both work with, but the Barbadian public in general with that enslaved legacy that we all live with today. So without further ado, Mrs. Michelle Hinkson-Cox.
Good evening, everybody. And again, welcome to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society on this wonderful Emancipation Day. My research at the University of Glasgow is looking, as Kay would have said, primarily at how we can use the creative arts to discuss issues around reparations, certainly emancipation, but it's called unearthing or excavating the silences. And the idea is that we want to be able to share the narratives that have been hushed. One of the very special things for me about the Newton space is the Shack tree. I don't know how many of you have been to Newton, but if you have been, you cannot but see and hear the Shack tree, the woman's tongue tree. And this particular poem that I've written is inspired by that tree. Shack. Shack, shack. Shack, shack, settling the noise. Shack, shack, wrestling the silence. Shack, shack, talking in tones, talking in moans and groans and sounds unknown, talking in tongues. Shack, shack, let woman's tongue speak, free lips from centuries that hushed me, hushed you. Souls renewed. Shack, shack, transport me back to ancestral memory, away from imposed religiosity, back to instinctive spirituality, built into bones, abounding in blood, breathing in me, through me, out of me. Shack, shack brings me back, fuels me forward. Foot planted in earth, roots funneling down, 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 down into ancestral ground, deep like the roots of the shack tree, shading me, beckoning me, entrancing me. Contradictory to quickening noise, stillness. Noise of her seeds begging for release. Shack shakes the shackles of spiritual slumber, emancipation, Ifa awakened, stillness broken. Drum beats flow in the wind, they sing through her branches, body entranced in the rhythm of her movement. They are here. Ancestors known and unknown. Ibaye, Ibaye. Thank you. Kay is running. Oh, I thought you were coming back, sorry. She is coming back. With Dr. Yannick Hume. Unfortunately, she could not be with us this evening, circumstances beyond her control, so I have the esteemed pleasure of also taking on that role. So again, welcome to everyone here at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and this lecture series. which is hosted by the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and also the University of the West Indies Department of History and Philosophy. This evening's feature address is my dear friend, my colleague, my elder, Dr. Deryck Murray. He is the director of the Center for Hybrid Studies, which is a Barbados-based research and development program agency. He holds a BSc in biology from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, but later crossed the campus for his doctorate in history on the topic of Obeah as a way of knowing in contrast to Western science. Dr. Murray coordinates and lectures a university-wide course on science, technology, and medicine in society. He's also given lectures in gender studies as well as African Caribbean traditional religions. His main research focus is on African spiritual technologies as valid ways of knowing. He was the last director of the Government of Barbados' Commission for Pan-African Affairs, during which time he designed, established, and sat on the government's first task force for reparations. This evening's presentation is entitled African Religion and Spirituality at Newton. To truly understand and value the ancestral legacy of intangible heritage at Newton, it is necessary fully to grasp the depth and pervasive nature of African spirituality in Barbados as orchestrated from its birth around the 1640s to present. This discussion will describe the African spiritual context in Barbados at significant junctures in its history, while situating Newton in its diachronic and synchronic contexts. It will necessarily address the complex mixing of cultures over time, the role of African spiritualities, technologies, Obeah, for healing bodies and societies, justice, war, and the construction of power. Ideas for mining this legacy for inspiration, innovation, and invention in every area of development from government to art, as well as science, medicine, and technology will be explored. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium, Dr. Deryck Murray.
Yeah, I know. Good evening, everyone. I know that you're enjoying this, but that was just to give you a taste of what African culture and spirituality is. I chose that clip because that is actually 2022, the National Thanksgiving Service in Barbados. And it was a historic moment because nothing like that has ever been done at our National Thanksgiving service. Our National Thanksgiving service is really a church service, a Christian service, decorated with some other traditions, spiritual traditions, and faiths. And we were able to have this invocation done by the Orisha priest, Agba, and it caused all sorts of controversy and backlash. The minister, I'm certain that he had an earful. And on the Monday morning, I think this was I can't remember if it was a Thursday or Sunday. Yeah, because it was church. But then on the Monday, I don't know if everybody here is familiar with brass tacks. There was one of the first callers said that, we had this demon worship thing on the stage. We don't know what the government is doing, and we shouldn't allow these types of things. So, of course, it was thoroughly offensive because he took one of two of the oldest spiritual traditions in Barbados and blasphemed one of them. Of course, the two oldest traditions are Anglicanism and African spirituality. And they're not additive or mutually exclusive. So when you become an Anglican or a Catholic or whatever Christian, it is still very possible to be of some African traditional faith. And so like in Haiti, we say that, it's 80% Christian and 100% voodoo. So we don't need to add them. But that's what happened. And, a while ago, I started to wonder and study this whole notion of African spirituality, but also how did we come to despise our own spirituality so much? That same year, there was an Ifa priest who had a lecture in Queen's Park, and there were Christians outside protesting. People inside peacefully having their spiritual work, Christians outside protesting and marching and so on. It was amazing. And we really need to understand how it is that we arrived at this juncture, what the history was. And so I'm going to try to retrace a bit of the history. Newton, of course, is the focus. I should tell you that even though some of these things clearly happened at Newton and we have evidence for it, a lot of it is extrapolated because Barbados is a small place and we have the evidence for other places in Barbados and sometimes the region. So we have to extrapolate a little bit where the evidence isn't clear at Newton. So let's uncover Newton a bit. And forgive me if I have to do two things. I have to do two clicks at the same time, one for the laptop and one for the screen. So I'd like to thank the University of the West Indies and the Barbados Historical and Museum Society for having this lecture. I think I'm usually impressed by people who are courageous enough to have these public talks about what is essentially Obeah. And although I know it's a courageous move each time, really I know in the heart of hearts of Barbadians it's a popular move because in my experience, nobody don't like Obeah more than Barbadians. Barbadians love Obeah in all its forms. The key sources that I'll use for this work, if you want to follow up and check to see whether I'm telling the truth or not. This book, Plantation Slavery in Barbados by Jerome Handler and others, is a seminal work on Barbados' history, centered on Newton, but on Barbados' history, its spirituality, its the cemetery at Newton and so on. And it's a worthwhile book to get both for the content that it is dealing with immediately and also the references that you have access to that you will find in here. So a lot of seminal work was done in this book. It's a fairly old book, 1978. Most people have investigated the archaeological, some of the cultural parts of the book and so on. And the part of the history which we love to do, the part of the history which says that this planter owned this thing and the economics of it and so on. But the spirituality in the book I've hardly heard anybody speak about. The other reference, if you could actually get at it, is my own thesis in university library. I don't know that you can get at it. I think that section of the library is closed and careful for now, so you'd have to come to me directly for it. I usually charge about $600 per page or so for information, if you want it. Or you can just call, I'll email it to you, or parts of it. So Newton has been in existence since the middle of the 17th century. Samuel Newton started buying up land around from the 1650s to the 1660s. And fairly quickly, he had 2 large plantations. He had 2 large plantations, and that is the period when the sugar revolution was coming into its own. In another 20 years or so, Barbados was the jewel in the crown, and the sugar revolution was at its peak, and the planters were making unimaginable sums of money. So by 1645, we had about 18,000 Europeans in Barbados and 6,000 enslaved. This is at the start of the sugar revolution. By the 1700s, by the late 1600s, we had about 18,000 so I think those numbers are wrong. We had about 20,000 in the early 1800s enslaved. Well, 47,000 by the early 1800s enslaved. So I'm giving you these figures because I want you to know that between 1645 and by 1700, we imported thousands of enslaved Africans. Thousands of enslaved Africans. And that's important because on Newton, we had about, by 1700, we had about 260-something slaves on that plantation. And I'm giving you those numbers so you know that there were enough to actually start to do spiritual work. So I want to make a short note on the interpretation of evidence that we find in the history. So mundane interpretations of African activities by writers with a European worldview necessarily miss the highly complex and involved spiritual work being performed. So there is an author by Michael Mullins, and he has a discussion of blood oath, plays, and ancestors. It's a book he wrote in the British West Indies and American South. And he cautions that Africans did not make the Western distinction between physical and spiritual existence. So I repeat that. Africans did not make the distinction that Westerners make between the physical and spiritual existence. For them, the universe was fully inspirited. Living and inanimate things were cut from the same cloth and so often react to similar forces or powers. So it is therefore reasonable to believe that Africans participating in Newton's early settlement invoked their gods and other spiritual entities both on routine and for routine and important occasions. So who were the Africans who came? It's extremely difficult to pinpoint the ethnic groups that came. The most we can do is try to track the various ports that they came from, and the port would change depending on ethnic warfare, on economics, and so on. But if we had to summarize it, if we were forced to say who likely came, these are the groups that would have been there. And I'm just going to pick out the Ashanti and the Igbo, because other evidence, linguistic and other evidence, points strongly to those two ethnic groups. So they were making a life of their own as soon as they landed and they had the numbers. So as soon as there were significant numbers of Africans, they organized themselves. So by 1679, Newton already had 260 Africans. At that time, the larger plantations averaged around 150 to 200. So immediately, they sought to establish and invoke spiritual forces by adapting to the new environment. In keeping with West African tradition, almost every specialist worker would have had spiritual associations that accompanied their activities. With several sages being responsible for the knowledge that sustained and manifested some force or power that was important to Africans ordering their worlds, numerous specialists were needed to accomplish highly involved, arduous, and complex craft and spiritual work, including performing rituals to bring down the powers and consecrate spaces. In other words, when European writers are just talking and describing mundane things that Africans are doing, they're often missing the point that there's a spiritual side to everything that they did. So the Africans also brought with them the technology of how to retrieve knowledge from their ancestors. In other words, talk to dead people. Ancestral communion is fundamental to West African spirituality and serves as a source of knowledge and guidance. Africans in Barbados were adamant in continuing this tradition. By the late 18th century, they were burying their dead in the floors of their homes or in common cemeteries near to slave settlements on the plantation. And Newton had both. So a few at Newton would have buried their dead in the villages. There isn't any evidence that at Newton they buried them in the floor of the house. But that happened elsewhere in Barbados and around the region. But at Newton, there was a cemetery close by. Both the governor and the Barbados Council around that time noted that it was a major challenge to relocate the slave settlements for health reasons. Apparently, some of these settlements were in places that weren't too healthy. Some of the enslaved were getting sick. And some of the planters wanted to move them, to relocate them, but they had already buried their ancestors in those locations. And it was a tremendous challenge to have them move. In fact, they simply wouldn't move. And as anyone who's involved with any African tradition would know, spiritual tradition would know, that guidance from the ancestors is crucial, especially at that time when they were trying to reestablish an African world. Remember, they're in Barbados. There is no pre-established African world. They're now trying to reestablish an African world. And so they would have needed to do libations, call on the ancestors, get guidance for the work that they were doing. So this work, during what I call the African phase, Creighton also calls it the African phase. And this is sometime between 1645 and the end of the 17th century, 1690s, early 1800s. And this African phase was so called because the majority of blacks living here were directly from Africa. And we didn't start to have Creoles until 1690s and so on. Africans, blacks actually born in Barbados. Now, I want to be very clear on this use of the term Creole. So when I use the term Creole, I simply mean that they were born here. When other historians, some other historians use the word Creole, they're actually saying creolized, and they're referring not just to the individuals being born here, but also the culture being creolized as well. In other words, those individuals are also creolized. The distinction I'm making is that in 1690s, they were definitely born here, but they weren't, their culture, their behaviors and so on were still very African. So they were Creole only by birth, but not in terms of African culture. In my own analysis, I don't particularly treat Barbadians born around that side, around that time, much differently from Africans brought from Africa. There are some slight differences. It's a nuanced discussion, but I'm saying that because there are others that do. As soon as you're born here, they think that automatically you have a different culture. But creolization did necessarily happen from the beginning. Mixing among the ethnic groups occurred. So obviously you're bringing people from all different ethnic groups. So first they have to learn to live with one another. They have to learn to cooperate. They have to learn to survive. And everything from language to the way they greet one another and so on, they had to come to compromises, and there was some mixing and creolization. Further, merely existing in a different place demanded that novel ways of manifesting the knowledge, which they had arrived with, be developed. But they were constrained to operate under the plantation's time and space with new materials. So they adjusted ritual spaces and times while using things that were at hand to build their world. So for example, they were forced to dedicate Sundays to ritual work in the mid-17th century because that was the only day that they had free. So Legon mentioned that on Sundays in the afternoon, they played their music and they danced. However, contrary to his impression of this being for entertainment, it is likely that these involved extended performances were ritualistic as well. So rituals that were performed at different times during the week in Africa had now to be conducted only on Sundays. Not fully grasping the significance of these, Ligon was surprised that they would play the music a whole day and never even overheat themselves. If the ritual in Barbados were anything like those normally performed in West Africa at that time, they would have been planned, organized, and conducted by several specialist priests. Sometimes I'll use the word priests, sages, interchangeably, including diviners and craftsmen and craftswomen who constructed and consecrated indispensable musical instruments and ritual implements. Ligon observed that they played kettle drums of various sizes during these rituals. The lead drummer, who appeared to be the best musician, played the smallest drum and called while the other drummers answered. Remember, this is around the 1650s, right? In typical African call and response arrangement. So the work involved in preparing these drums for ritual performance reveals the prevalence of African sages in Barbados during the period. So I'm taking some time to go through this because very often in the literature, you will see some reference to Obeah priests. But if you take that at face value, you'd think that they were the only priests who existed on the plantation at the time. So my point is that almost every specialist craft person had some involved training and exposure to the spiritual side of the craft. and they had to be sages at the same time. So traditional drum making in Africa, and this is an example, had several complicated steps. It involved selecting the appropriate trees and animals, appeasing the spirits, protecting the craftsmen, and consecrating the finished drums. So R.S. Rattray, an anthropologist who did extensive work on the Ashanti, said, when an Ashanti craftsman wishes to cut the particular tree from which he's about to carve a stool or drum, or whatever it is he's about to make, it behoves him to be very careful how he sets about it. The trees upon the wood of which a carver chiefly depends are all trees with potentially vindictive spirits. To protect himself from dangerous spirits, the woodcutter strives to appease the spirits of the tree upon which he is about to play his axe by placing offerings before it. He may also say, I'm coming to cut you down and carve you. Receive this egg and eat. This is the offering is an egg. And Rattray continues to develop what it takes to make a tree, the spiritual side of what it takes to make a drum. I should tell you that one of the first things that Africans in Barbados did when they arrived, when Ligon explains this, is that they made drums. That's one of the first things that they did. And again, this was creolization because they had to use trees that they were not used to in Africa. They had to use animals that they were not used to. They had to use the materials that were at hand. And they also did the spiritual work to accompany it. They, of course, had tools that could help them make choices, so like divination to ask the tree if it's prepared and if it wants to be a drum, if it's willing to give up its wood. The animal for the skin, the same thing. So the very first thing we did when we got here was to prepare the rituals and so on, to develop and to reconstruct the world that we were used to. We know that in Trinidad and in Cuba, similar steps are used for making a drum. We also had musical sages. And all of this is as soon as Africans got here, because this is Legon and one of the very first writers. So there was an enslaved African by the name of Macaw, and apparently he was a highly trained and respected African musician who demonstrated and occupied his leadership role among Africans as the keeper of the plantain grove. Keeper of the plantain grove meant that he was responsible for distributing plantains for food for the enslaved. So he was highly respected by both the whites and the blacks. And he was given this important role not just because he was a leader, but because he had excellent music-making skills and he could make instruments. So he saw Legon with an instrument called, somebody can help me to pronounce this, a theorbo, that's the instrument. It's a string instrument that they used in Europe, but it reminded him of the balafon from Africa, and he immediately went and made one from the materials that he had. So he was an extremely gifted sage, but I'm pointing out these things to point out that this work required knowing both the skills, the practical skills, but also what spiritual work to do was necessary beforehand, and it was usually quite a few steps and quite involved. When midwives around the same time had to assist in giving birth, one of the things they would do is light a fire at the foot of the woman who was giving birth. Another ritual that was important for them that did not just involve the skill. So many of you by now have heard of the 1675 plot by Coffee. And this is where Coffee had planned a revolution to take over the entire island. So just to give you context, this is before 1700 has even arrived. 1675 Barbados is at the height of making money from sugar. We have 40-something thousand Africans on the island, and Coffee decided that he's going to forge a revolution to take over the entire island. Usually, when you read about this in the history books, you just see that a chair of state was already prepared, bows and arrows, trumpets, and so on, all the paraphernalia and regalia that he needed to be crowned as king. So I want to point out the spiritual work that was necessary before, while they were preparing for this. So first of all, you don't just decide that you're going to be king in African tradition. Oracles have to do divination. They have to make sure that crowning you is the correct thing to do. So there would have been divination on the plantation to confirm that Coffee was the correct person and that crowning him was in proper order. They had wrought an exquisite chair of state, bows and arrows, trumpets and gourds. They had made them. And to make every one of these would have required spiritual work before, and then and even while you're producing, make the artifact. In West Africa, for Ashanti kings, for Coffee, a white stool would have had to be made for him before he was crowned. That's if he was Ashanti. We're assuming he's Ashanti, but it might not have been, but if he were. And then, while he's alive, he would have had to blacken the stool, which means putting a bit of his blood on the stool, so that that stool can be used to call his spirit after he died. So this 1692 plot revealed the involvement of Creole sages. Creole meaning some of them were born in Barbados. It included carpenters. Well, sorry, the 1675 plot was, the planners at the center of it were directly from Africa in the main. And they did all that work to crown Coffee, but that was found out. People who are familiar with the story, and before Tuna discovered what they were planning to do and took it to the master, and the rebels were flung out. That's the story where Tony says, if you roast me today, you cannot roast me tomorrow. Many people do not speak about the next plot, which was in 1692, just as wide. So it means that Africans in Barbados were always plotting to take over the country. And at the center of that were carpenters and bricklayers and wheelwrights and blacksmiths and so on and so forth. So we can see, and the general point I'm trying to make to you is that from very early, we really need to think about Africans on the plantation, or the plantations in Barbados, to be to see a prevalence of spiritualists and priests on the plantations from very early. And Creighton calls this making a life of their own. They used what they knew to make a life of their own. So I want to talk a little bit about Obeah. So there were all these priests and sages and so on, but then there were the Obeah priests, right? So Obeah, today known as Obeah, was an attribute of the original African spiritual complex established in Barbados by the early 18th century. So the term Obi and its plural, Obeahs, so it's Obeah, and this is originally how it was spelled. And then sometimes you say it in the plural, O-B-I-A-S, Obeahs, are mentioned by the white Barbadian Thomas Waldock as early as 1710. He was writing to James Pettifer in England. So the terms were probably in common use among the Africans at the time. Some historians and linguists suggest that the term originates from some negative Twi or Efik or Igbo word or words that translate as evil magic, witchcraft, or sorcery. Jerome Handler was the first to persuasively argue that the original term was either neutral or positive as it is used in Suriname today, although it was taken from Barbados to Suriname. So he offers the Igbo word for their diviners. So he's trying to track now the origin of this word, Obeah. So Jerome Handler suggests that the word could have come from the Igbo word Dibia, D-I-B-I-A. D meaning husband or master, and Abia meaning wisdom. So that is one interpretation. So now there are negative translations, and this is Jerome Handler's more positive translation. So I want to propose another origin for the word Obeah in Barbados. I want to suggest that there is no need to look for a word in Igbo that was corrupted to produce the word Obi, because if you use Dibia, then it means you have to corrupt the word in order to arrive at Obi. But there's actually, the word Obi that actually does exist in the Igbo language. It is used to identify any central organizing force or principle. In Igbo thought, the term Obi literally means the heart. It is a concept used to comprehend diverse functions as well as emotional and moral attitudes. Obi is the seat and center of virtue and vice. The heart is said to know, to hide or tell information. In Igbo architecture, Obi is the male meeting house of an extended family. So if you have an extended family where the male, the head of the family meets, the male head of the family meets, that's called the Obi. It is often the conceptual and physical center of a domestic Igbo architecture, and it can serve as both a domestic, spiritual, ritual, and spiritual space. So that will be that center space in the architecture can both be for domestic reasons or for spiritual reasons, and it is used as both. It is also where the emblems of the ancestors are kept and sacrifices are performed. To me, it makes more sense to believe that that particular word, which doesn't need to be corrupted, which has meanings, pervasive meanings in Igbo context, including spiritual meanings, could be a more likely origin. So what about Obeah at Newton? Jerome Handler found burial 72, a middle-aged black man who was likely an Obeah priest. And the conclusion that he was an Obeah priest came from the fact that he had grave goods. So he was buried with a necklace made of these cowrie shells that you can see, canines from a dog, multicolored beans, various colored beads, a pipe, bracelets, and at the time, even though in the 1650s to 1700, graves usually had some type of grave goods, more so than later on. This was an unusual amount, and it seemed to, from his analysis to Professor Handler, that this was likely an Obeah priest who was buried at Newton. Yeah, because during that time, the burial was east-west, and we don't know if that's because of Africa and being east and so on. We honestly don't know the reason, but then later on, probably due to European influences, in the slave cemetery, they were west to east. But we had a priestess, and I wasn't too sure whether I wanted to put in this one, and you don't usually hear about this one. I don't think Jerome wrote anything extensive about this, except to say that she was probably an Obeah priestess, and she was buried prone. She was buried facing down. And so his conclusion is that it is likely that she was probably feared or causing problems on the plantation spiritually. And so they buried her face down. The reason that I was a little bit reluctant is because in that 1675 plot, it was Anna Fortuna who revealed the plot. And now we are seeing burial number 9 being a woman facing down. And I didn't want to run into problems with the women, saying that the historians looking for reasons to think that the women are the worst. So it's not me, it's Jerome Handler. And yes, it was Anna Fortuna who did that. So in the last 2 decades of the 1700s, the 18th century, most of the Obeah sages in Barbados were elders, so they were getting old by then. But respect for elders was an established African tradition. So for example, although administering oaths, so I'll speak about oaths a little later, was usually the purview of the Obeah sages, the Obeah priests, any other black elder, man or woman, could administer the oath, and it would still be held in great reverence and horror. So some whites knew that spiritual sages, Obeah priests, were extremely powerful in Africa. According to Atkins, high priests and priestesses could humble both the king and the people to supply their wants. So these priests were held with equal reverence in some places to the king themselves, and sometimes more. So Atkins was describing a type of spiritual hierarchy that was likely to have been established across the West Indies with Obeah priests, because we always see that the Obeah priests are the most revered across the region. But he insists on the superior cunning of these sages. And so speaking about the West Indies generally, and with more authority on St. Christopher, we had the most experience. The writer Granger, who suggests that the power of these conjurers generally derived from them having greater understanding than the average African, and the fact that they use this intelligence to delude the others. So now we see where this idea of African traditional sages being frauds started. He called them artful. So this notion of Obeah sages being more intelligent than the average enslaved black is repeated by others such as Edwards, these are writers I'm calling, white writers, who called them crafty, and Atwood, who also saw them as artful in explaining their influence and success. These observations, though intended to highlight how skillful the Obeah specialists were at this deception, are really admissions by the white writers of the intellectual sophistication and genius that just justifies the categorization of sages in the sense in which the Kenyan philosopher Oruka calls them in terms of sagacity. According to Granger, in magic spells in Obeah, all sons of Africa trust. In other words, he's just saying that everybody, all the black people at the time, believed in Obeah. And he goes on to further speak about Obeah men and the power that they had on the plantation. So I'm going to go fairly quickly. No, this is really a talk because I was told that my time ran out. So I'll go fairly quickly. Obeah was also used for defense and justice by the planters because the black people on the plantation did not have a court to which to take people who did something wrong. And for the Africans on the plantation, it was extremely important to grow their own provisions. They had to grow their own provisions. Sometimes that's for them to survive because what they got from the planters was not much. And they were not only very successful in growing their own provisions, sometimes they could sell them to make money to use for other purposes. So what would you do if you have to protect your provision ground? Well, if somebody's coming to steal things from your provision ground, you work Obeah on them, right? So you prepare your Obeah and you say something like, may the thief be reduced to the same state and condition as the corpse which lies buried in the grave whence this dirt was taken. So you use grave dirt as part of making your Obeah. May his existence be short. This is a serious curse. So may his existence be short. May he not live to enjoy his theft, but be crumbled and trampled on. I think it's a little bit draconian for stealing some yams and corn and so on. But this is what they had to resort to. And also, this didn't just apply to protecting themselves against other Africans looking to steal their provisions and so on. This is the same technology and work that they worked against the white people, the white planters. So Obeah for war. So I'm saying all this so that you extrapolate in your mind that much of what I'm saying is happening on other plantations in Barbados is also happening in Newton. Newton was one of the larger plantations. Very few things would have missed Newton. So if you're going to start a war and you are the oppressed, you're enslaved Africans on the plantation, it is absolutely necessary that you only work with people that you can trust, because the punishment for being found out is death. So in 1675, when Kofi was planning his revolution, he likely had to perform secret oaths. Now, I'm not so certain about the oath in 1675. What we do know is that there was an oath, because when Anna Fortuna gave up the guys, the fellas, and they were caught, there was one enslaved that was, they had them strung up and torturing them. And there was one rebel that was just about to give up the secrets for the others who were involved. And this is when Tony said to ask him if he's going to get everybody killed. And the reason Tony knew that he was about to tell the secret is because he asked for water. He asked for water to drink, to sip. And it was said at the time, and this is in the evidence, that was the custom if you were about to reveal a secret. Amongst the Africans, you would take a sip of water. But that would mean, this isn't said in the evidence, but that would mean I'd have to infer that they were bound by an oath previously, and the water was supposed to break the oath. So a secret society had to be forged amongst the rebels in order to fight this war. The same thing was done in 1692. In each of these, the rebels had the secret for years, even from their wives. 3 years, sometimes, and sometimes more. And in 1692, it was said explicitly in the evidence that they were bound by a fearsome oath. The evidence is clear in places like Antigua and Jamaica and so on, where the process of this oath taking requires that the standard oath, by the way, around the region is that you take grave dirt, you mix it with some water. Sometimes there'd be some blood mixing from a feather from a bird, and you drink that, and you swear to not tell the secret. The consequences of revealing the secret would be that your stomach would swell and you would die. And you see that evidence across the region very clearly. Actually, I wrote a paper on a court case that involved an oath like that. So the rebels would have been bound in a secret society, and every time they were about to go to war across the region, including Barbados, every time they were planning for war, they had they formed a secret society bound by that oath. I think that we need to bring back that oath so that we can keep secrets when we're planning things around here. Because especially with cell phones now, then before the end of the secret is done, half of Barbados knows what's going on. Now, what about 1816 with Bussa? You know, you don't see historians writing about an oath or anything. But we know that Jackie says that they went by him and all were given names. And Mingo, from everything I could see, it seems as though Mingo was responsible for that. Not to mention the fact that they went to a party before they were actually to before they actually started the rebellion. Most people, throughout the literature and throughout the reporting in Barbados, you hear the European writers talking about Africans loving to go and dance and having these plays and dancing and for hours and hours on end. It is my thinking that those, what they call dances and so on, sometimes they call them plays, were actually feasts and ritual work, and that it wasn't any different for the Bussa Rebellion, that what they called a party that the rebels went to the night before was actually a feast. And I don't see, I mean, seriously, if you're going to war tomorrow, you're going to party today, right? You're going to do ritual work, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We all know the damage done by education and the church. But just so that you know that it wasn't, by accident. This gentleman, Philip Gibbs, in 1797, he was recommending that we baptize children immediately at the age of 8. And knowing that Africans love ritual, what they would do is that they would do the baptisms in such a way that the ritual of it would impress the blacks. That was consciously thought out and as a strategy to get blacks to embrace Christianity. But even then, they were saying that, yes, the blacks, the Africans would come do the baptisms and so on, but it didn't mean anything to them. They were still doing the actual rituals and holding on to the rituals. This happened, that resistance to colonization, to mental colonization, happened until we introduced formal education, and it happened up until when the missionaries started their work in earnest. It happened, one, because for two reasons. At least two reasons. One reason is that creolization has 3 levels, right? We have the level of the mixing that I told you about, where you just use the materials that you have at hand. You don't have a choice. These are new materials. You need to use them. The other level is where you're just improvising and innovation and so on. But the level that is most resistant, that people usually ignore, is the level of the worldview, the knowledge that you have internally, and especially that part of the knowledge that you're not consciously aware of, the rituals, assumptions, and so on that you just pass on. Everything from how we dance, how we walk, how we speak, the stories we tell, the rituals that we think are important, were handed down to children. This is why I say to you that even though we had blacks being born in Barbados as early as the late 1600s, they were not really, we could call them Creole, but they were not really Creolized as yet. That really only started to happen when the missionaries decided that they were going to really engage Africans and convert them. And when we started to have a formal education system that could begin to change our worldview. And even then, even now, even today, still very difficult. So what is all this about, and why would I even have any interest in pursuing this work? Why care about all this thing? This is history, interesting and so on. But how does African spirituality, African knowledge come to bear on anything that we need to do for the future? You know, for most people, the sooner we get past that, and not just for blacks in Barbados, and not Barbadians, Africans in Africa as well, the sooner that we get past this primitive, backward, irrational worldview and these rituals, the sooner we can get on with the real proper work of Western rationality, scientific progress, modernity, and so on. So my work really was to demonstrate and validate African knowledge systems and African spirituality. That wasn't the job tonight. It was just to outline the presence of African spirituality on the plantations for you tonight. But since there is a reparations task force, and since we can't escape speaking about reparations nowadays, I'll just finish up with telling you about reparations. This is one of the, we have no idea how much we've lost in terms of our knowledge, our philosophy, our philosophies. When during the scientific revolution and the Renaissance, Europeans collected knowledge from all over the world and used for their inspiration. Sometimes they understood it, sometimes they didn't understand it, but they mined the rest of the world, everybody else's knowledge. If for no other reason than that, we should pay attention to the knowledge and recover the knowledge that we lost. We're here in the museum, So a museum is not just to see old things, it's to muse, it's to get inspiration, it's to help us think of new ways to go forward. So some new theoretical frameworks, I already mentioned one earlier, which is Obeah. The notion of central organizing principles and forces is not something that you find often in Western knowledge system. They tend more to be reductive. We reduce everything to one thing and then try to build the world from that thing that we've reduced to very little. What is the fundamental essence of reality? I don't know if there are anybody in here who studies Eastern philosophy. Anybody knows what prana is? Prana is supposed to be an all-pervasive type of energy that pervades everything. But there are similar concepts in Africa, right? So most of the priests, there are a few Lukumi or Yoruba priests here tonight. They know of Ashe. And Ashe is not just a greeting and so on. It's the fundamental stuff out of this fundamental life force that moves everything. The Igbo call it chi. So chi is not just a Chinese word. The Igbo call it chi as well. It's called Tassav by the, can't remember which tradition, which ethnic group calls it Tassav, but that's another name that they use. And quantum mechanics has now reached the point where they're trying to figure out what is the fundamental stuff of the universe. Maybe we have something to offer if we study our own tradition. But here's something more fascinating for you. In quantum mechanics, there are 16 fundamental particles. And not only are there 16 fundamental particles, they're not actually particles at all. In other words, they're all just one wave. So there are 16 entities which are one wave, which we see manifested as all these electrons and quarks and so on. But in the Yoruba Odu, there are 16 Odu. And these 16 Odu form a matrix that forms the entirety of our reality. The only difference really, and I suspect that the philosophers are circling to that, is that these fundamental entities in the Odu and so on are actually conscious and living entities. And maybe Western scientists may reach that point where they understand that everything is made of consciousness and so on. But I could be completely wrong, but we wouldn't know unless others get on board, recover our own tradition, and study it in such a way that we could, the very least that could happen is that we may stumble on something new and innovate. The rest, I won't go through all of them. Respect for elders and so on, we need to recover. Psychosocial modalities for healing found in divining and the way we divine, the way that we go about diagnosing and treating people. Plant medicine. This is, I see herbalists today preparing plant medicines. They just, it's almost like Western science. You just find this one thing and you grind it down and you extract it, you put it in the form of a pill, and that's your herbal medicine. That's not how Western African medicine works. It's always a ritual. It's always treating the plant as though it is a living, conscious being. And that part we've completely lost or forgotten. And by the way, I did some research in St. Thomas years ago, and a lot of those rituals and prayers that went along with the preparing of herbal medicines and treatments were still there. And things like philosophy of consciousness and so on, we need to recover. And finally, AI, artificial intelligence. We don't know if it's conscious or not, but perhaps if we take some lessons from our African traditions, we could begin to work out whether AI could become conscious, whether it is already conscious or not. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll listen out for your questions. Any questions right now? Oh.
Okay, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation, Dr. Murray. We are now going to open the floor for questions, and we also invite our online audience as well. If you have any questions, you can post them in the chat. Those of us who are here in the wall garden space, please make sure that you come to the microphone, which Kay is holding, one on each hand, to answer your questions. Yes, sir.
Of modern.
People already recognize.
All right. First, I need to clarify something about Obeah. In Cuba, in Trinidad, in Jamaica, there are actual spiritual systems with names that are full spiritual systems, like Orisha in Cuba, and Winti in Suriname, and Lukumi in Cuba again, Kumina in Jamaica, and so on. Obeah, though, is not really a spiritual system in the sense that these other systems are spiritual systems. The way that Jerome Handler defines it is that it's a catch-all. So what really happened was a white planter, Walduck, not a planter, he was a visitor, heard the word, decided that this is the name of the African spiritual tradition. The whites started to use it, and then anything that looked like African spirituality, they decided to call Obeah. So it's a catch-all system. Now, so to answer your question, almost any African ritual and so on would be a form of Obeah, if you want to use it as a catch-all. Right? So almost any African spiritual, any African tradition. So communing with the ancestors, you know, to enter African traditions, most of them, the very first thing you need to do is to commune with your ancestors. So you set up a glass of water, altar, a candle, you put some flowers, and you pray. And you call the name of your ancestors, which, by the way, is what happens in the Bible. You know, I don't know anything about the Bible, except that they have this long list of names that they call at certain points, the whole genealogy. So right there, they're telling you, well, you need to call on your ancestors. Remember these people. Right? And by the way, it's not a metaphor when we speak about ancestors. So it's not a metaphor like we're calling them because we want the memory of them to give us inspiration. We believe ontologically that they exist. They're just on the other side of a curtain that we can't see, but we can use our technologies to commune with them. All right, good evening.
You mentioned that you found evidence of certain rituals in the past. Could you elaborate on that?
Which part that was?
The herbs. You said the preparation of herbs. You do work in St. Thomas.
Yes. There's a organization that I did some research for, and it was a survey. And so it was in Welchmont Hall, I think, and a few other places around St. Thomas. So we targeted the elders in the community. And they, so for example, you collect herbs at a particular time of the day, right? You collect a particular number, so seven different types of herbs. You leave them, you collect at a particular time when the moon is out, right? You'd say certain words when you're collecting them, and so on. So that was a general pattern with the herb. So it wasn't just a case of you go and pick the herb at any time, you know, because what's important is what's in the chemicals in the leaf. And by the way, this wasn't informed by, because people could say, oh, well, it makes biochemical sense because the plant is going to have a different chemistry at night, you know, on a particular day and so on. But these, you know, this culture wasn't really informed by biochemistry. It was informed by the communion with the spirits of the plants. So I don't believe that the elders in St. Thomas had that fundamental knowledge of how to commune with plants, how to divine to find out what they want. But however that knowledge came to Barbados or was developed, it carried through till that was in early 2000s. So to this century.
What about the term nihilism?
Mayal.
Is that interchangeable with Obeah? Because we hear it in Jamaica, it's very common.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the same explanation I gave. If you use the term Obeah as a catch-all system for anything African, yes, but then the word then becomes almost meaningless, right? But Mayal is a specific Mayal is a specific African tradition with specific rituals and so on that developed in Jamaica.
We have a question at the front. Yes, ma'am.
Evening, Dr. Murray, and respected brothers and sisters.
Greetings, guys.
Thank you for your wide-ranging presentation. And I suppose what I was looking for, I didn't get, because you didn't narrow down a lot. When you talk about Christians vis-a-vis the African, it puts over a false theory, so to speak, that African and Christian don't go together. So I have to stand to say African and Christian go together. What you present as Christian for Barbados is not the African Christian that I am, because our African Christianity predates Anglicanism by centuries. Predates Methodism, Moravian, all of them goes back to first century. Our African Christianity also goes beyond the 66 books of the Bible that people know of, called King James Version or other versions, to all 81 of them, which are recognized by the early Christians. So when you speak of Christian in Barbados, you're speaking of actually a clash between those who departed from us many years ago and the African traditions that were brought. I noticed that the word you use the term king, and they can't use the term king when you were brought against the day. So I have a different perspective. I'm interested in the many burial grounds rather than the Newton burial ground only. I was one who was asked to come and do a prayer some years back, in Obeah, of course, to, I don't know if you want to call it consecrate the Newton burial ground. And I noticed that it's called burial ground rather than a cemetery. I noticed that you use the word cemetery, thank you very much. You see, a burial ground and a cemetery have different connotations, especially when it comes to Western Christianity. And the cemetery is more dignified than the burial ground. I'm interested in all of them because, as you indicated, it is something that happened many places. And when I raised it recently at one of the consultations on culture at the government forum, it was suggested that I am looking for us to want to look everywhere in Barbados. But nowadays we have technology that is called what? Ground penetrating radar. And if we want to find them, we can find them. So I'm asking whoever can get the thing done to let us move beyond the symbolism of Newton and get to fully respecting those of our ancestors who are buried many places in Barbados. They are not all over the place. There are certain places where they were allowed to bury, and then other places where we're doing business here, we're doing agriculture, cannot bury here. The wider Barbados is not buried. I am a bit troubled, have been for a long time, with what's happening on our pierhead here. Because from what I'm told, could be wrong. I don't have no reason to think it's not so, that there was a mass grave involved around the area there. And we need to do all that we can to fully respect our people, our ancestors. Now, I want to get this ancestors part. You said that there were, what, 98% Creole that was born here by 1790 or 1796. I want for us to look at, for those 98%, how many of them had Barbados born fathers, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, to see what it is Africans. Yes, African ancestry, but how far back does this Barbados bornness go? How many generations? I think we need to look into that. There are many other things, but let's go a little bit at the top.
I just quickly answer the Christian business. You came late, but I said at the beginning there are two long traditions in Barbados: Anglicanism and African traditional spirituality. So I didn't mean to have to qualify every time I say Christian that I'm really speaking about Christians in Barbados and the Barbadian brand of Christianity. The other things I would be for another time. Except to say that I once asked, Professor Handler Jerry about other grave sites in Barbados, and his immediate response was, well, the whole of Barbados is a cemetery. Every plantation.
Good evening, Dr. Martin. You spoke about the safety, burial of Newton and then Princess and Marquise. And what about the children? Were there any children in that hierarchy that
No, I don't know. I mean, Tara would be the best person, Tara Innis, when it comes to children and so on, but I don't recall, and I don't know of any. You mean that were considered priests or that were buried at Newton?
that were related somehow to the family of Princess or
Oh, no, we don't have any information on that.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Martin. I wanted to follow up on the question about the spiritual system and how Obeah is a catch-all term. Is there anything to indicate that there may be systems which are, if not uniquely Bajan, but were predominantly practiced there, that we have yet to uncover? Or is it more so that we have a sense that there may be different systems being practiced?
That's a very difficult question because, first of all, because of all the ethnic groups that were contributing. And Creole, so it would have to be a Creolese system. And secondly, because the system that develops could depend on the ancestors that you commune with and where those ancestors are for and the instructions that they give you. So that would be a challenging one to pin down, except that I know of one woman that was, this family was reported that, members of the family would live to a really old age. And the matriarch would be seen drawing a circle around her on mornings before she does prayers. And when they asked her, well, what was that for? She said, well, that's for God. So outside of that, I don't know much more. What I can tell you though is that Barbadians, you'd be surprised at the Barbadians who secretly are interested in spirituality, not just African spirituality, but spirituality. But they like church, and they go to church, and they love Jesus, but they're interested in this technology, and perhaps that's because we see it as a technology. We don't necessarily see it as religion and church. It's a technology for communing with other forms of consciousness.
this is a good time, I think, to introduce our online question. We have a question from our online audience. They want to know if you are aware of any modern-day practitioners of Obeah.
I know a lot. But again, it depends on what you call Obeah. if the question is, are there in Barbados many people who practice African traditional spirituality? The answer is yes, and it is growing. You know, there's a growing Orisha community. There are other traditions that I know of practice from other parts of Africa in Barbados. And so yes, there's that. But then there's also this side of it, which is, I believe that many Christians practice Christianity. They practice their Christian spirituality in an African way. And of course, they wouldn't say Orisha or spirits or, so they say the Holy Ghost, they say so on. But I hear of, I don't know, I hear of rubbing down with oils. I hear of water being used. I hear of, well, the bush baths are really our traditional thing. I hear of speaking in tongues. I hear of possessions. I hear of all these things that really and truly are really African. But this is not new. You know, in Antigua, they had a custom that used the Bible because as the Bible is introduced, it was integrated into the existing African systems and used. So they had a strategy where they used the Bible. They hit the Bible 3 times, they open it to a spot, and then they do a prayer and so on. And when they were asked, well, what was that supposed to do? And they said, well, that was to confuse let's confuse the white people. So they actually, we incorporated the Bible as just another material that could be used within an African spiritual worldview and framework. So yes, to answer the question about if there's Obeah being practiced now, I would have to include the African-like components of Christianity that I see today.
Okay, good night, everyone. Dr. Murray, thank you for a very, very enlightening talk. I want to take you back to the first question you raised, which is, how did we come to despise our own spirituality so much? And the protest of the Christians about the incorporation of the Orisha practitioners in international celebration. It seems to me that one of the issues is that those Christians, and I take the note from Brother there about the difference between the Europeanized version of Christianity and the original Christianity from African Kemet. So, but it seems to me that there is a lot of fear amongst those who practice this Christianity and a high level of insecurity that anything about it might be questioned. So I guess the question I'm posing is, how do we help them to move past that? How do we help them to come to a Barbados where all of these forms of spirituality are just accepted, and it's not considered an issue whether you call yourself Christian of a particular denomination or Orisha or whatever. How do we get that conversation going in the country to move past this kind of blind ignorance and responses on that?
Well, I don't think you were here yet. Well, you were here. I started the evening with the National Thanksgiving service. We need to have multi-faith activities. But I, probably more than most people, know the philosophical depth to which that is problematic. Because in the Western worldview, like with science, there could only be one science, right? Science could only have one answer. You can't have 2 answers that are correct. The same thing happens with the book religions, what I call the book religions, based on the Bible and so on. There can only be one answer. There can only be one interpretation that's correct. You may have several interpretations, but my church believes that this one is the correct one. So the challenge with that is that you will never, you will, at most, you will always only tolerate others with the understanding that they're wrong and that at some point you're going to need to bring them to heel. In African spirituality, it is different. African spirituality, you add spiritual paths. So the missionaries could never understand how a mother could have her child baptized by the Methodist this week. And if a Moravian priest comes next week, go and have it baptized with them, have it baptized with the Anglican Church. Because as far as she was concerned, the more blessings you get, the better. The more power and forces you add, the better. It was not mutually exclusive. It was not, you know, I am the only path, this is the only way. Right? So as long as you have that, I think it's going to be very difficult, but it's also a Western way, a Western worldview that in matters of knowledge, not in matters of culture, you know, you can have your culture and dance your own way and so on, but in matters of knowledge, in science, there can only be one answer. It can only be one rationality and one reason, right? Which is a different way of viewing the world. And that's the depth of the problem. It's not a simple, superficial problem. Also, I also partially knew the answer why we were demonized. Obeah priests were always at the center of the rebellions across the region. And so after the Buster Rebellion in 2018, even though we had a law against Obeah, it was deemed ineffective. And they brought the law from Jamaica, which targeted Obeah priests. They didn't say that that was the reason, but it was obvious that that was the reason, because these priests are the ones who were causing the problem. And from then, it was necessary. It wasn't a question of mere faith and so on to demonize Obeah. It was a question of security.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Murray, for a very insightful presentation. I have 3 points. One, I'd like to add to your list of the 2 spiritualities at the beginning of Barbados, Anglican and African spirituality at the Amerindian.
Yes.
And as you know, we tried to have them involved in the service in 2021, and that got pushed on as well.
Yes, good.
Secondly, the grave artifacts that was found in the grave of the priests. There's a carnelian bead there, and I saw an article from that Dr. Tara Annis sent me and said that that bead actually came from Gujarat in India. And there's linkages here. And I always wondered how did that actually end up in Barbados in the hands of an enslaved, you know? So that's a mystery to me. And the third point, I was amused with, well, not amused, I was amused but also interested in the prayer or the person who would come and steal and what was left for them if they did steal. And I was wondering if that was something that was passed down from generation to generation, because I'm familiar with the itinerant trade, what we do in Barbados as a Kuli man, being accused of having a bit of baku or steal donkey. And I was wondering if that was a tradition or something that was passed down that ended up being associated with that as well, as the word baku, we never knew where it came from. Or I have not figured out where it came from, and then the steal donkey concept. So those are the 3 ones.
I am just as mystified as you about the Baku. The only thing I really know about the Baku is that you shouldn't mess with them. But I suspect the necessity, though, to go outside the planters' judicial system, their court system, to seek protection and justice would have been something that was pervasive. And we say all the time, because there's some things that you can't take into the courtroom. You know, there's some things that, you know, some offenses that simply wouldn't make it into a court. And people find alternative ways. And I often joke with people about, and this is why I say Christianity is practiced in an African way sometimes, right? You know, when you offend a Christian and they say, I'm going to pray for you, what is it that they usually mean? They mean, I'm going to pray for you. You are going to become a better fella and live lovely and enjoy life and get the blessings of God. Or they mean that I want God to give you a stroke tomorrow and that you die and go to hell and burn forever. Right? Or I leave you in the hands of the Lord. Do they mean that they're leaving you to get, the graces and the warmth of the good Lord? Or that you'll get some serious karma soon from my Lord and my God? So which is it? To me, that's really a form of Obeah, right? That's really Obeah dressed up otherwise. But as I go on, you realize that I am less and less confident about the term Obeah because it was used to mean anything that looks African. And so that's, it started here. So you have the honor of starting Obeah in Barbados. It was, in 1710, it was mentioned here. It was taken to Jamaica from here when the planters colonized Jamaica and Suriname as well. So Barbados is really the Obeah headquarters of the world, in case you were wondering.
We're going to take one last question.
Good night, Dr. Murray. I conduct a lot of genealogy and history research, and I have had, coming into my space, the surname Sage. And I am wondering if you can share any knowledge about that surname in the late 1700s, 1800s information that I dealt with for a particular family. The Sage surname surfaced, and tonight you've thrown more light on it. I had hesitated to discuss what I knew about sages with them, and I just wondered if you have any information on persons who then became surnamed Sage. The individual that I discovered and had to discuss in depth with his family was located in the parish of St. George in the Mount area. This would be someone who clearly was born in the mid 1700s and appears enslaved.
Okay.
Do you have anything on that?
Unfortunately, no. It's not my area of specialty. Bobby Morris, Pedro Welch, they're really the experts on names in Barbados. But when I use the term sage, it wasn't in terms of a name.
I realize that, and that's why I wondered if you had had any academic interface with material that suggested that the person who was seen in the community as a sage, then post-emancipation, the sage became officially that person's name, and the years then apply as a surname post-emancipation. Because this seems to be filtering into the research that I have identified with this particular person. So I just wondered if you had seen any, come across an interface with any information about the person who was a sage, who was known as a sage, and then it transferred and became the surname. I just wondered if you had anything on that.
Yeah, no, actually, no. In fact, I've never actually come across the term sage in the historical evidence. I borrowed the term from the Kenyan philosophers because they speak about community sages and philosophic sages, and to describe the holders of knowledge, the keepers of knowledge, and the practitioners of knowledge in a community. but I used it because sometimes in the literature, other names are used that are derogatory or that um, give the don't give the regard to the practitioners that they should. But I have never actually come across the term sage in the literature.
There's actually a victory in the last 2 weeks in the paper on the first of our surname statement block. And I think it's a very important area for the university to perhaps explore based on what you shared tonight with the persons that carry that surname stage. It may be something, I have no time right now because I'm working on a massive project, but there might be somebody here in the audience who might find that they can move forward with that, or even yourself and your students, because I think it could lead to a very important discovery. And with regards to the children buried with the priestess on Newton, wasn't sure if you meant if there were skeleton remains of children in the same burial plot as the priestess, or if you meant children who died on Newton.
No, I was thinking more along the line of children who were connected someday to the priestess.
That's what you meant, yeah. I wonder if that's what you meant. So therefore they were buried, if there were children buried, skeleton remains in proximity to the person identified, possibly.
Yeah, the same
as a
kind of
person.
hierarchy of burial.
That's
That's
another
what it was.
interesting, yeah.
The priestess was actually buried separate and apart pretty much from everybody else in the burial ground. So there isn't really any kind of tracing her connection to other mounds or other spaces, other bones, other persons
Or
who
any
left
children
here.
buried the same way, same kind of artifacts, weaving, that kind of thing.
I don't see the connection on that one, so I can't answer that one. I would have to defer to Kevin or Tara.
Yeah, no, I don't. I was interested in the Obeah people in the documentation. In terms of the other skeletal remains, I don't know a lot about them. You done?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Murray. I think the response of everyone tonight shows that there definitely is quite a bit of interest in this topic. And I really want to encourage all of us to do our own research, whether that means coming out to more events like this, doing the reading, whatever that means for you, having conversations. Because to answer the question that the gentleman asked about how do we, kind of combat this fear that some people seem to have, a part of it is to have these conversations as well. If we wait for it to happen on a national level, it becomes a little inorganic sometimes. Sometimes you hear way too many speeches. Not digging at anything there, but sometimes it is just in these kinds of one-on-one conversations that we begin to break down the barriers. So thank you again, Dr. Murray, for encouraging this conversation in this space tonight. And as we talk about, educating ourselves and having more information, I want to invite you to come out to the next panel discussion on August 22nd. The topic is going to be Africa's sacred burial spaces in Barbados. So we're looking at having, it's a panel discussion, so we have Ms. Katura Bab. Suleiman is going to be joining us on the panel. And we also have the Deputy Director of the Museum, Kevin Farmer. And the panel will be moderated by Dr. John Hunt. So you can look out for more information on that and certainly put it in your phone calendars, reminders. We're here again on the 22nd of August. Again, thank you to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and the University of the West Indies for hosting this very excellent lecture series. We have a bus tour on Saturday, African Sacred Spaces. At what time, Kay? 9 a.m. So the bus is leaving at 9, not Beijing 9, like actual 9 o'clock. So, right, so you do need to call the museum tomorrow to book if you're interested in joining that bus tour. Remember, it's not Beijing time, it's actual 9 o'clock on your watch phone time, okay? All right, so thank you all very much. I believe there are refreshments at the back. Refreshments at the back. Thank you very much for our online audience for joining us. And we will see all of you on August 22nd. Thank you.